Hey everyone, I'm Daniela, a foreign language lover and an English teacher and pronunciation coach. Okay, let's talk about language learning. Much has been said about different methods of learning a language. There are people who swear by flashcards, while others find them unhelpful. Some people claim that actively learning grammar before starting to use their target language is crucial, but others find grammar exercises boring and daunting. So, what's the best way to learn a foreign language? Through learning or through acquisition? First, let's talk about the difference between these two terms. According to Google, learning is the acquisition of knowledge or skills through experience, study, or by being taught. Wikipedia also defines learning as the process of acquiring new understanding, knowledge, behaviors, skills, values, attitudes, and preferences. On the other hand, if you Google acquisition, you see it being defined as the learning or developing of a skill, habit, or quality. So, according to these sources, there is no clear difference between learning and acquisition. But when it comes to gaining knowledge in a foreign language, scientists and linguists make a more clear distinction between these two terms. When they discuss learning, they usually mean trying to memorize vocabulary, sometimes out of context, and putting a large amount of effort into understanding unfamiliar grammar rules. On the other hand, they use the term acquisition when they refer to the natural process of absorbing the language. It's similar to how children learn, acquiring knowledge without actively trying to force themselves to remember. This is the knowledge all of us have without knowing how we learned it. It just feels natural and obvious. In other words, learning is the conscious effort we put into mastering a language, while acquisition is obtaining the knowledge subconsciously by communicating with others, listening, observing, and just living our lives using that language. Now, here's the big question. Which one is better for us adults? Learning or acquisition? Many experts in the field claim that children and adults learn languages best through acquisition. The famous linguist Stephen Krashen argues that we acquire a language when we're exposed to comprehensible input. He calls this I+1, that is, exposing ourselves to aspects of the language that are only one step above our current level. It's easy enough for us to understand, but still challenging enough to learn and not to get bored. He and others who support this theory suggest that adult learners not waste their time on drilling grammar, memorizing words out of context, or taking tests. Instead, learners should focus on reading stories, listening to interesting content that they can understand in the target language, watching movies, and just subconsciously trying to absorb the language. According to the supporters of the acquisition theory, learners shouldn't worry about grammar rules as they will gradually learn how to use different rules in a natural way. Now, I'll discuss my own experience with learning 2 foreign languages as an adult and why I agree, but also partially disagree with this theory. Besides my native language, which is Bulgarian, I speak 2 other languages, Polish and English. I know a little Russian and Spanish, but I'm nowhere near being fluent in these. I'm also currently learning Portuguese. By the way, I'm recording my experience with learning it, and I'll share it with you later. If you've watched some of my other videos, you might remember that I lived in Poland for over 2 years before coming to the US. I had never studied Polish before I went there. I have to say that although both Polish and my native Bulgarian are Slavic languages, Polish grammar and pronunciation are quite hard even for Bulgarians. The first thing I did when I went to Poland was memorizing how to say the months of the year. They were actually pretty exotic to me because in Bulgarian they sound quite similar to English, but in Polish they're very different. I don't know why I decided to start with the months, but I was super proud of myself when I memorized them. Then I taught myself how to read. There are certain letter combinations in Polish which produce different sounds than the same letters pronounced individually. But once you learn them, it's not hard to read, even if you don't understand what you're reading. So I started buying fashion and gossip magazines, and yes, this was a long time ago when people still read magazines. Of course, I didn't understand most words, but I kept reading. I also watched tons of TV. I remember I picked up many words while watching a Peruvian soap opera that was dubbed in Polish. How funny is that, learning Polish from a Spanish-speaking soap opera translated into Polish? I also have to tell you that my husband is Polish. We met when I was there. Of course, that made things much easier because I could always ask him if I didn't understand something. But I must say, I was naturally acquiring the language pretty rapidly. I did start taking lessons later on, though, which helped me understand some grammar and notice some pronunciation nuances I hadn't been able to notice on my own. But to be honest, I still make some grammar mistakes in Polish, even after years of speaking it, because I didn't have enough time to learn all the rules when I was living in Poland. Now that I live in the US, I speak Polish only with my husband and occasionally with my in-laws, so I don't think further acquisition is possible for me without any formal lessons. That is, if I want to make zero mistakes. When we moved to the US, I started learning English. I had English lessons at school in Bulgaria, but honestly, I could barely say anything. Actually, I took some English lessons in Poland a few months before we moved to the US, but they used a different method. I have another video where I talk about all the methods I used when I was learning English. You can find a link to it in the description box. In the US, I also watched tons of TV, but I started taking English as a second language classes 2 weeks after we arrived. I have to say that these classes helped me a lot. What we did there was something in between learning and acquisition. We read stories, my classmates and I talked to each other and the teacher as much as we could, but we also did study grammar and new vocabulary was introduced every day. In fact, when I decided to go to college a few years later, I passed my grammar exam with such a high score that the person who checked my test told me she rarely sees that. And I mean native speakers included. Now, here is where I stand when it comes to the learning versus acquisition dichotomy. As I already mentioned, I failed to learn English back in Bulgaria. The traditional language classes where you have to drill a bunch of words and grammar didn't work for me. I do way better when I'm among people who speak the language and I try to interact with them. Of course, this is almost impossible in the beginning if you don't know any words, but I love watching movies. I learn way more from watching a movie than from memorizing words out of context. When you watch a movie, you see people interacting in natural situations. Seeing body language helps as well because we don't communicate only with our mouth, but also with our body and facial expressions. I like reading as well if I can understand most of the text. When you're reading, you can stop, go back, and read the sentence again, paying attention to syntax, choice of words, spelling, etc. Our brains are perfectly capable of acquiring a foreign language at any age. A non-native speaker is absolutely able to reach a native level depending on the language, of course. For example, if your native language is German, it'll be easier for you to learn another language from the group of the Germanic languages like Dutch, for instance. But if your native language is Chinese, learning Dutch could be harder. However, and this is a very important however, we as adults are biased by the grammar, phonetics, and even pragmatics of our native language. We're never going to be like kids who haven't learned much yet and are just absorbing new information. Grammar structures that we were never exposed to are always going to be harder to acquire. And in many cases, it doesn't matter how long a person has spent in the country of their target language. For example, I talk to people whose native language is Spanish and who have lived in the US for 10 or even 20 years. Many of them still say people is instead of people are because the word people is singular in Spanish. They're otherwise fluent, but some of them make some grammar mistakes and need someone to point out these mistakes for them to notice. Another aspect is pronunciation. When we're babies, we can hear and pronounce all the sounds in the world. But as we age, we lose this ability. That's why when we hear a vowel or a consonant we don't have in our first language, we tend to interpret it as one that we are familiar with. It's rare for an adult person to sound 100% like a native speaker, and this is not necessary. But there is a difference between losing an accent and knowing how to pronounce sounds clearly. Many adults acquire English or another foreign language just fine, but they sometimes fail to notice the difference between how the sound should be made and how they make it. You'll be able to notice certain things after a while if someone is willing to show you your mistakes. I remember when I worked at the front desk of a Marriott hotel in Minneapolis, I used to ask guests if they would like a mop. After a while, one of my coworkers said, "Why are you asking the guests to mop the floor?" He was laughing, of course, making fun of me. But then I realized that I was mispronouncing the word and giving it a different meaning. I repeated map after him a few times, and I never made the same mistake again. However, I've been in the US for 15 years and I never realized that I was saying oven instead of oven and iron instead of iron until I took a pronunciation course. Native speakers don't correct adults the way they might correct kids because they feel uncomfortable and they don't want to offend anyone. As long as they understand the message, they won't point out the mistakes. And this is one of the reasons some people would never notice their mistakes and might remain at the same level, making the same mistakes for years. This is the major difference between kids and adults. Adults don't notice some mistakes until someone points them out. According to the noticing hypothesis proposed by Richard Schmidt in 1990, learners are unable to further advance their language abilities or understand specific linguistic features if they don't consciously notice and pay attention to the input. In other words, listening to the language without noticing certain nuances and differences will not bring much of a benefit. The truth is that many adults feel more comfortable when they've learned a little bit of the language if they're planning to move to another country. They won't be anywhere near fluent and they will still be embarrassed when they try to speak because that's what we adults are experts at, constantly being embarrassed about something. But having learned some basic words and phrases is a great start. So I think that some learning is definitely beneficial. The last point I'm going to make in favor of learning is that certain professions like journalists, writers, or language teachers, for example, require a native or near native knowledge. And I don't believe you can reach such a level only by acquiring the language and without any formal learning. I mean, if you started learning as an adult. There would always be that little grammar mistake or mispronunciation if someone doesn't point that out to you. Guys, I think acquiring the language naturally was definitely a better option for me. As I said before, I failed to learn anything by the traditional school methods used in Bulgaria. However, I strongly believe that learning should start at some point after you've already acquired some of the language. Acquisition and learning should go hand in hand. One should supplement the other. The question shouldn't be whether to learn or to acquire. This shouldn't be either or. We should strive to acquire and learn at the same time. To acquire a language, you don't have to live in the country where it's spoken. Yes, it would be easier, but I see many people who've been living in the US for many years and they still don't speak good English. This is because they surround themselves with other people who speak their native language. So living in the US doesn't automatically mean immersion, and living in your native country doesn't mean that you can't immerse yourself. Immersing in English is particularly easy nowadays with YouTube, Netflix, and the internet overall. There is no excuse if you really want to learn and acquire. You can also join my Free Speaking Club, where you will meet incredible people from all over the world who come to practice their speaking skills. You can find the link in the description box. Now, you tell me what you think. How do you learn better? By drilling grammar rules and vocabulary, or by gradually trying to understand and learn when you watch a movie, for example? I'd like to see your comments below. If you found this video helpful, please click on the like button below and subscribe if you haven't done it yet. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.